Welcome to the stage, founder and executive director of Summit Impact, Shira Abramowitz.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you for that. For anyone I don't know yet, my name is Shira Abramowitz. I'm the executive director of Summit Impact, and we're the new 501c3 social good arm of Summit. Our mission, thank you. Our mission is to activate the power of this community to create a more regenerative and equitable future. We've built a fellowship program that has supported 108 fellows from 23 countries around the world. We've also piloted an impact labs model where we now build topic-based impact labs like our democracy lab and our criminal justice lab. And we're building more coming up soon. We actually have an exciting announcement that in January 2024, we are launching a climate lab. So you in this room are the first to know. And the way the labs work are there are cohorts of Summit fellows, and we build year-round programming that includes strategic introductions, events, and curated projects to further the fellows' objectives. So with our climate lab coming up, over the next few months, we're going to be opening up applications and nominations for fellows, building a leadership council, and refining our topic focus. So our hope as we dive into these sessions at Summit at Sea and get to hear from some of the most amazing speakers in climate is that you'll also take us up on the invitation to further this work year-round, to join our climate programs, and to convert this learning and inspiration into action in the months ahead. So with that in mind, as the baseline, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first climate speaker of the event, Tom Chi.
Hi. Tom? You out here already?
Oh, okay. I was going to say more.
Oh, continue.
Now it's like I'm saying it to you.
Oh, thank you.
So Tom is a remarkable innovator. He's known for things like scaling Yahoo Answers from 0 to 90 million users, from using his rapid prototyping approach at Google X to build Google Glass and self-driving cars. He's also just really known for helping any team move at new speeds and jumpstart innovative ideas. And he's done this with countless organizations and founders around the world. And most recently, he has become known for his work as a founding partner at One Ventures, where he's quickly becoming a field leader in climate investment with unmatched returns. And I had the wild opportunity of meeting Tom about a decade ago on another ship when we were working with the Unreasonable crew. And since then, something I have really deeply admired about Tom is how he's always able to expand his mind to new scenarios and new paradigms, to really invite us into how we can hold new perspectives, and then from this new way of seeing, start to rapidly iterate and create solutions and make them real in the world. So he's here today to introduce a new way of understanding the world, a new frame for all of us about what it would take to create a net positive future, and what kinds of inventions and scaling and mindsets it will take to get us there. So with that, let's give a big second welcome and round of applause to Tom Chi.
All right. It's already more applause than planned, so this is great. Okay, so this is what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about how to help humanity become a net positive to nature. But in order to jump into this, let's start at the very highest level. So something that you guys may already know, but maybe you don't, is that since the invention of agriculture, the human population on the planet has increased by more than 1,000-fold, from approximately 7 million before agriculture to more than 8 billion today. And I think that people hear this number already, just the population number, and there's already some despair that sets in, where they kind of think to themselves, oh my gosh, maybe it's just too late. We just have so many people. We're already beyond a bunch of ecological limits. Like, is this even going to be possible? Like, can this even work within the laws of physics to make it possible that this many people could exist on this planet in a way that doesn't destroy the planet? And very normal kind of reaction, but I'm here to share some thoughts that might shift that a little bit. So turns out that if you were to take the biomass of all of humanity, so if you took everybody and just kind of weighed us all together on the same scale, it would end up being about 350 million tons of biomass. And that's basically the biomass footprint of humanity on the planet. Now, coincidentally, there's another kind of group of organisms that have roughly the same biomass. So if you add up all the ants on the planet, it actually ends up being roughly 350 million tons as well, plus or minus 15%. You know, some ecologists, biologists still working that out a little bit. And in this way, ants and us are basically exactly the same. We actually take the same biomass footprint on the planet. Now, beyond that, we're similar in a lot of other ways. Ants build societies that have different roles. Ants build architecture. A lot of ants are omnivores, just like us. So they have a lot of similarities to us. But one way that they're very different is human beings only eat about 2.8% of their body weight per day. And ants, by comparison, eat roughly 30% of their body weight per day, over 10 times more, which practically translates to, in any given day, human beings will consume about 10 million tons of food, and ants will eat over 100 million tons of food. And effectively, ants are eating what 80 billion people would eat. But we're not sitting here thinking like, oh my God, ant overpopulation. If we could just get these ants down, we'd have a chance to live on this planet. Of course not, right? Because ants have somehow figured out how to literally consume 10 times more of the planet than us every single day, and somehow not F it all up, right? And not only do they not mess it up, they actually provide a ton of valuable ecosystem services, nutrient recycling, aeration of soils, lots of valuable services to every ecosystem that they end up populating. So it is actually not about the amount. It is not about 8 billion versus 80 billion. It's not about 10 million versus 100 million. It is actually about the style. The style in which we've chosen to consume is one that is highly destructive for every ton that we end up, consuming. And many other organisms on the planet, and ants are not the biggest biomass on the planet. I just chose them because they're so much like us. There's a bunch of organisms that have a way bigger biomass footprint than ants and us. And they're doing just fine as well. So this is truly a style question and not an amount question. Now that said, a lot of changes in order to go get that done. But the way to go and summarize the difference in style here is ants are able to exist at this population, eat 10 times, consume 10 times more of the planet than us, because they're basically following this simple rule, which is in the process of existing, can you create more ecosystem services than ecosystem consumption? If you do that as a species, you're fine. Honestly, you could consume a very large percentage of the planet as long as you're providing more ecosystem services than consumption, and things actually work out fine. And not only is this the rule for ants, but it actually is the rule of basically every organism on the planet other than us right now, right? So this is us just, not needing to completely change everything about everything. This is us just trying to catch up with most of the animals on the planet. Most of the beings on the planet are already following this rule, and this is the reason why they're able to live on this planet for billions of years and make actual life on the planet more productive by existing as opposed to what we've been doing. Now, this then begs the simple question, which is what does it look like for humanity to provide more ecosystem services than ecosystem consumption? Or another way to go phrase it is, can humanity become a net positive to nature? Can we have it so that our basic existence on the planet, nature is healthier every year that we're around because we're around? Now, in order to go explore this question, we need to get realistic about where we are right now. And that aspect of things is not so great, actually. So this is a graph of effectively the entire Industrial Revolution. So this is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air in 1750. And this is the sum total of all of our activities. So you see how much coal we burned, how much oil, how much gas, how much cement. Not talked about as often, but land use changes, huge, huge emissions footprint. It's just we don't think about it as an industry. We think about it like, hey, we drained this wetland, big deal. Oh, we cleared out this peat bog, big deal. Oh, hey, whatever. We clear cut this forest, big deal. We think about that in like 20 different industries, but it's actually also enormous. Now, if it was just human activities, and human activities constitute everything on the left side of this graph, if it was just human activities, we would already be on a fully unlivable planet. Like you look at the stats over here, 280, we'd be up, around, up in like the 580 range by now, which is not a planet that we would want to live on for sure. Now, luckily, it hasn't just been us, because if you look at the right-hand side, nature's already had our back. Nature's been trying extremely hard to fix the problem, even though we have not been trying hard to fix the problem. And nature has already sequestered almost 600 billion tons into the ocean. They have sequestered more than 600 billion tons into the land, and this is kind of terrestrial biomass, soils, wetlands, this kind of thing. And then the remainder is still up in the atmosphere. So this is still sitting up there. As of 2022, we're up to 417 parts per million on average. When I first gave this talk, it was 408. So we're not doing so well on all this. Now, it's good news that nature is helping us, because if nature wasn't helping us, we'd already be in terrible, terrible shape. But for nature to help us in this way, it's also taxing things quite a bit. So the absorption of that 600 billion tons into the ocean, it comes at the cost of the global ocean has increased in acidity by 30% since the Industrial Revolution. Like, think how much water that is. It's an enormous volume. But we've actually created enough carbon dioxide, not quite 1 trillion tons, obviously, 600 billion tons have been absorbed into the ocean, and that has increased the total acidity of the ocean by 30%. In addition, the trillion tons that's still left up in the atmosphere, this is the stuff that's driving climate destabilization. This is the stuff that is leading to the bad weather patterns, every kind of thing. And actually, the stuff that has been sequestered into the land is actually mostly fine. And that gives you an interesting clue of some things that we might be able to do to start changing this dynamic. Now, in addition to this, which is kind of the audit of the entire history since the Industrial Revolution, at least relative to our relationship to atmosphere and climate, then there's other bad things that are happening right now. And right now, remember, I'm just talking about getting a realistic understanding of where we are. So for example, we're on pace currently to extinct coral reefs, all shallow water corals from the planet within 35 years. All those species will just be gone. And in the process of losing all the coral reefs, then 25% of marine species that we know of live directly on the reef, and they will die instantly with the reefs going. That's not the end of the bad news, because about 15% more of the ocean has either their reproduction chain or food chain closely tied to the reef, even if they don't live there most of the year. And it means that somewhere between 25 to 40% of the ocean will be extinct by about the middle of this century. So pretty bad news on this front. If you don't care about animals or biodiversity at all, it also directly affects 1 billion people in terms of their livelihoods, their food sources, all that sort of thing. So if you only cared about people, this still matters. But this is, when you go down the direction of extincting 25 to 40% of all those species, that's an arrow that you can't turn back. I mean, a bunch of these things can re-evolve, but talking with coral scientists, they're like, well, coral could re-evolve, but it'll take about 15 to 20 million years. So I'm not sure who's banking on being here in 20 million years. I'm not totally guaranteeing that we as a species will be able to do that yet. So I think it would be way better for us to be extremely thoughtful in these next 30 years and kind of change course here. So obviously the damage is large and the time is short. So let's go back to this question, how could we become net positive given all the things that have happened so far? And to go address this question, I'd like to introduce you to an idea. So the idea is called an invention catalyst. An invention catalyst is a type of invention. And it's a type of invention that doesn't just change the object itself, but changes the way that you think about entire systems, entire ways of organizing beyond the object itself. So if you have a toaster and then you invent a better toaster, well, maybe it toasts 15% faster, or maybe this one can take bagels as well as thin sliced things. Great, the toaster is a little bit better. You've invented a better toaster, but the world has not changed just because your toaster is a little bit better. You have a slightly better toaster. And that's a fine invention. An invention catalyst is something like, oh, this starts to happen, and many domino effects, many catalytic effects from there. So as mentioned in the intro, I was part of the founding team of Google X. I worked on things like Google Glass, self-driving cars, Project Loon, the contact lens that can continuously measure your glucose levels, new approach to artificial intelligence called Google Brain that does semi-supervised learning, a bunch of different things. But relative to the cars, then if you could imagine a world where most of cars could drive themselves, most of the vehicles out there could drive themselves, well, there's one important step that you need to know to understand why this would matter at the system level. So right now there's about 1 billion cars on the planet. And the average utilization of these cars is about 4%. It means 96% of the time that people own cars, they're not using them, right? Just think about your own car. It's like, I'm not in the car more than 10% of the time, even if you drive a lot. Like, you're not in your car more than 10% of your life. The typical utilization of a car on planet Earth is 4%. And that's a lot of raw material that is going to waste. It's not providing any transportation utility. And you can imagine a world where you have self-driving cars on like a taxi service. And instead of everybody owning a car, they can just call up the car that is appropriate for the task. Oh, you're trying to do home improvement? Get a pickup truck. Oh, you're trying to go on a hot date? Great, get a sports car, right? Like, go order up the car that you need for the task, get all the same transportation utility, but each one of those cars, instead of being utilized at 4%, you could easily imagine them being utilized at 30%, 40%, and still have plenty of time for charging, plenty of time for maintenance, all that sort of thing. So in a world where you could go from 4% utilization of a complex object like this to 40% utilization, it turns out that you don't need nearly as many cars. Right? You could literally cut down the number of cars on the planet by 70, 80% and not hit transportation utility at all. And just imagine the major cities of the world with 70 or 80% fewer cars. Right? We actually used to joke in the team that, like, once we actually got it all working, and I can talk a lot about exactly where we are right now. It's pretty far along, and also it's not everywhere yet, as you know. But once we got this working, we would go to all the cities in the planet and find all the signs that say parking lot and erase the trailing letter so it just says park. Right? Because like 30% of urban areas are basically used for parking. Depending on the city, like the real flat cities, even more than that. Could be 40, 45% depending on your city. So it's like, imagine being able to reclaim 30%, 35%, 40% of a city for natural areas which help combat, heat island effect or create community spaces, all that sort of thing. It could completely revolutionize many things beyond just having a car. So you guys get what an invention catalyst is, right? Like, it's not just a slightly better car, it's a thing that could change entire systems because it now exists. Now, let's take this idea of an invention catalyst and let's bring it to that question of trying to get to a world where humanity can become a net positive nature. And with that, I'm going to go share some invention catalysts. As mentioned in the intro, I am now a professional investor. Like, apparently you just need to file some forms with the SEC. Anyway, but like, these are from our portfolio, so fully disclosed on that front. But I think you will get a sense of what an invention catalyst looks like practically in these settings. So one of the companies that we support is called Dendra Systems. The video was before they changed their name, so don't worry about that too much. And Dendra Systems is able to created a set of drones. These are very early days, the most modern ones. Actually, you'll see slightly more modern ones in the videos. But each one of these drones is able to plant 120 trees per minute. Right? And being able to plant 120 trees per minute is a real useful trick if you're trying to go and get ecosystem restoration and repair of the planet to happen at scale. So with that, we're going to watch a quick video of this, of them restoring some mangroves in southern Myanmar. Let's see if this runs.
Very important that it's so useful. It will be replicated.
It's taking off. You're going to hear a ticking sound. And each tick is a mangrove.
Coast and mangroves are so central for Myanmar.
So that's about 100 per minute. It's not 20 yet.
Make along the coast.
And then, yes, I'm also a DJ. I can count these per minute. Okay, so check this out over here.
For fish to grow.
So this is what it looks like 2.5 months later. And then this is what it looks like 14 to 16 months later. Same landscape. Right? And this was something that was fully impossible, 5 years ago. Right? 5 years ago, when we first invested in this company, they had planted one oak tree that was 1.5 inches tall. But by understanding, like, oh no, this mechanism is a totally different mechanism. This is something that could have a type of scale that human beings would never be able to organize enough people. And especially, mangroves are especially tough because they're on tidal mud flats. So when you try to go out there, you're at least, knee deep in mud, but sometimes you're chest deep in mud. It is not the best situation for you to be trying to traverse many hectares. And actually, to this point, this team just won a $30 million contract to restore all the mangroves of Abu Dhabi. So that's a 25,000 hectare restoration. We're not talking small scale. This is tens of thousands of hectares scale now that we are getting to. Now, why would this be important relative to that previous question, right? Well, it turns out that a tree at maturity, the typical tree at maturity, weighs between 2 to 20 tons. Giant redwood can be 2,000 tons, so lots of variation, obviously, but giant redwood is not a typical tree. But a typical tree at maturity weighs between 2 to 20 tons, and it turns out that trees are roughly 50% carbon by mass. So when you see a mature tree, a 2 to 20 ton tree in front of you, you are also seeing 1 to 10 tons of carbon. And where did that carbon come from? Well, it turns out that all of that carbon came from the air, and actually almost all the mass of a tree comes from the air. Like more than 95% the mass of a tree comes from the air. And actually, every plant that you see is basically crystallized air. That's actually where they get most of their mass from. They get a couple essential nutrients from the soil, but it doesn't actually add up to very much mass. It's just used in different very chemical processes in order to have their biology work. But yeah, no, plants are basically crystallized air, including trees. And it means that if you could get enough of those to come back, and we've already cut down about 40% of all trees on the planet as of this point, which means that there's plenty of space and plenty of room. Like the planet can obviously support a lot more trees than we currently have because we just took them away over the last 200 to 300 years. And I forgot I loaded in these things too. Yes, this thing works in a lot of ecosystems. We actually planted in 20 different ecosystems on 4 different continents already. This actually had been a strip mine up at about 1 mile above sea level in central Australia. It had been a strip mine where they extracted all the ore, and then after they extracted all the ore, they put the dirt aside, and then they put the dirt back on top. They call it the overburden. The overburden used to be called an ecosystem, but hey, this is what it looks like after the overburden comes on. And then the team went out there and planted for 1 week, and 18 months later, this is what the landscape looks like. And I want to point to this one because the mangroves are monocrop planted, but that's because the ecologist told us to do that. They basically said, hey guys, like the mangrove ecosystem doesn't really get started until the mangroves start coming up. Then we can plant other things, but you got to start with all mangroves. In this particular case, we started with 17 different species at the suggestion of the local ecologist. And this technology is able to plant in a biodiverse way, not just in wide, monocropping, like aimless monocropping. And I think a really beautiful metaphor here is we planted 17 species and we came back, a year and a half later. Well, actually, we checked in a couple times throughout the 18 months and we measured how many species were on the landscape. At that point, over 70 species. Now, what happened? Well, it turns out that even when you destroy the landscape this badly, there are still seeds underneath that are waiting. They're waiting for the conditions to get good again. And when those conditions come back, then things can start to flourish again. And I think it's just a beautiful metaphor for a lot of the work that we do. I think there's something latent inside of both us as humanity and also what nature hopes to do, that if we just stop being so damaging for a little bit, there's like seeds that are waiting to come back out and it's just not been safe or it's not been the right environment. And if we just give it a little bit of nudge, actually a lot more can happen from that nudge. Now, if you have an invention catalyst like this, what might be possible? Well, it turns out, you guys remember there's a 1 trillion ton extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? Well, if trees weigh 1 to 10 tons of carbon, then if you could plant 1 trillion of them, you basically get pretty close to getting a lot of that carbon back into trees. Now, what 1 trillion would look like would be 20 billion trees per year for 50 years. And it turns out that with this tech, it only takes about 9,000 drones and 450 operating staff and $80 million worth of operating cost, independent of seed costs. Like the seed cost, depending on what seed you're planting, can be quite expensive or it can be a fraction of a penny. But just the pure OpEx is actually quite inexpensive to go after the actual solving of climate change as opposed to, just adapting to everything will be flooded and burned and destroyed, right? Yes, and then this is another shot of that. Okay, here we go. Oh yes, this is the other thing to go mention because you guys are familiar with Moore's law and stuff, right? It's basically like, okay, like processors are getting faster at this exponential rate. And like one simple way to tell whether you're working with an exponential technology or not is it looks like a straight line on a log-log plot. So this is actually the first data point's up here, it's off the screen, it got cut off. But basically, this is a log-log plot with the price per hectare in terms of the cost of restoration coming down by factors of 10. And then obviously the scale of restoration going up by factors of 10. And you actually see, our first job was up here, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then I got to fill in the latest dots. But obviously, Abu Dhabi is like 25,000 hectares right here. So it's effectively, yes, we are, just like Moore's Law, we are cutting in half the cost of ecosystem restoration every couple years. And you're going to get to a spot where, honestly, a lot of things that we thought we couldn't afford to restore before will suddenly become affordable. Or if you were going to restore something, you might be able to restore 5 times more land with the same budget. Okay, with that, we're going to go on to a different catalyst because I need to finish on time. So this one comes from the land of agriculture and growing. Because obviously ecosystem restoration, those are things that we hope will grow back, but we have never spent any real-time funding before. Agriculture, we spend a lot of money on every single year. And there's a lot of different ways to do agriculture, but in all of the ones that, all the catalysts that I'm showing here, I'm showing options for us to get to 1 trillion tons of sequestration, in the right ballpark, right? So in this particular case, what you're seeing here is an image of Gabe Brown's farm. And people know Gabe Brown? Yes, some people do, very good. Yes, nice, this is an educated audience. Well, Gabe Brown is one of the kind of forefront pioneers on soil regenerative agriculture. And I had been reading about a lot of folks doing soil regenerative agriculture. I visited farms all around the world trying to go understand it. And Gabe's was a real standout. So I went to Gabe's farm with a team of soil scientists. And we actually took hundreds of soil cores, really characterized, what had happened on his farm and how he was doing it. And for folks that don't know the terminology, there's like Horizon A, B, and C soil. Horizon A soil is the richest, darkest topsoil, right? And then Horizon C is like the underlying substrate, and B is something in between. On the average farmland in the US has got 1/4 inch of Horizon A soil. That is what we are banking on to be able to keep feeding ourselves, 1/4 inch of topsoil on average across the US. It's a little scary, which is why the UN, Food and Ag organizations like, hey, things are going to get real tough within 60 to 70 years because we just kind of run out of topsoil. Well, on Gabe's land, he was averaging 29.5 inches of Horizon A soil. This marker from the crumbly to the slightly less crumbly is the Horizon A to Horizon B mark. And we took hundreds of soil cores. This was not an unusual core. Some of them had 3 feet of soil, of Horizon A soil. And he built this many feet of Horizon A soil in less than 25 years. So more than 1 inch of topsoil build per year. And not by throwing a bunch of inputs on it, but basically working with nature in order to have those management practices come up way, way better. Now, what we're seeing over here is Gabe actually took me to the edge of the land because he manages right now about 4,000 acres in North Dakota. And through his organization, he manages an additional 35 million acres. So he by himself is having a real interesting impact on the world. But he took me to the edge of the land, which is right next to his neighbor's land. And he kind of took out a shovel and just took a shovel of his land, which is over here. And he took a shovel of his neighbor's land, which is 50 meters away. And you can tell the difference, right? I mean, honestly, this probably doesn't even have 1/4 inch of Horizon A soil. And his neighbors had actually stopped growing for the last 2 years because when I visited, it was the 3rd year of continuous drought where that landscape had gotten less than 5.5 inches of rain per year for 3 years in a row. So everybody else around him had stopped producing. His farm was still producing at 95% capacity. Even with that little water available, the soils were so healthy that they could draw on this water from rains many, many years ago. And the residency time when a rain did happen fueled the crops for a long ass time. But the most impressive moment was, obviously you can visually see the difference, but Gabe was like, hey, Tom, let me try something. Can you smell the difference? And he basically held this up and he held that up. And I was like, I can tell they smell different, but I don't know any more than that. And then he smells his land, and then he smells the neighbor's land, and he proceeds to list out rapid fire 10 management practices where it's like, okay, they're short on potassium, and this is what they got to do. And it's like he's just using his nose. Like this literally happened in 10 seconds right in front of my face. And I was like, holy crap! What just happened? And for every day since then, for 6 years, because this photo is from 6 years ago, I've been looking for a replacement for Gabe Brown's nose, and I have now found one. But let me tell you why that's important first, right? So this is what's up with the use of land on the planet. So a bunch of the planet, 70% of the planet is covered with oceans. For, the 30% that is not covered with oceans, this bar across the top is a representation of what it is. So 71% of it is habitable, 10% of it is glaciers, like in the ice caps, 19% is extremely barren land, like the middle of the Sahara or some extremely low, biomass type environments. So only 71% of the surface area of the planet is habitable. And it actually turns out that we use 50% of that for agriculture, right? So when people say like, oh my gosh, how are you going to go get enough room for trees? Well, actually, if we could just fix how we did agriculture, then that would make a huge difference. And you can see trees are already trying to make their way back, right? They're second biggest by a lot. But like it's been cut down a lot. It was like almost 2/3 of the planet at some point, and we cut it down to 37%. Anyway, when you look at how agriculture is used, it's almost all in protein production, even though protein production is only 18% of our calorie mix. So if we could start growing more intelligently, and we could be managing a large swath of land like this in a way like what Gabe is doing, then you could potentially be drawing down, yes, the trillion tons of carbon deficit to the tune of, if all the soils in the world could get 11% richer in carbon, then that would actually pay back the entire debt up since the Industrial Revolution, right? In Gabe's land, he went from about 0.5% soil organic carbon to 13%. So that's a lot better than 11% better, right? He multiplied it by 30 times, right? It's enormous compared to the gap that you need to make. Now, and even if you just say, we're just going to do it on the land that we manage for agriculture, or even just the cropland, though actually his farm does both animals and plants, so it actually is applicable to that entire pie, then actually we could pretty quickly pay this stuff down to in the order of just maybe 2 decades. Now, we're not that organization yet, we're not that civilization yet, and part of the reason we're not that civilization is nobody has Gabe Brown's nose. Nobody can just pick up a clump of things and say, like, here's the management practice. You need these types of cover crops. You need to be focused on phosphorus. You need to be focused on whatever. He's just like smelling, just like rolling out of his mouth like that. Like nobody has it. But we just invested in a company that this is the replacement to Gabe Brown's nose. Obviously, right? Actually, this is how it all works. For people that have a background in physics and optics, it's kind of like a laser interferometer, but there's a couple different changes. The things are circularly polarized, the 2 lasers are offset by a 1/4 wavelength, and you modulate the intensity so that the square of their intensity is always equals 1. And if you do all that, then the mathematics allows you to magically subtract out fluorescence from Raman backscattering. And Raman backscattering is one of the most sensitive ways for us to measure anything on the planet. It's about 1,000 to 10,000 times more accurate than the next closest way of doing it. But we've never been able to do it out in the wild. We can do it in a lab when there's just one molecule that we're looking for on a backdrop of a different molecule, right? You can use Raman to go measure that extremely closely. But when you get to something as complex as soil, then there's this noise, which is called the fluorescence floor. And nobody's been able to remove the fluorescence floor from Raman until these folks did. So now we have a tool where you can scan your soil in the course of just a couple minutes, and it'll come back with all the readouts. So it is slower than Gabe Brown's nose, but it does the things that Gabe Brown's nose does in terms of here's all the compounds that are in there. Notably, it can also tell the difference between labile carbon, biological carbon, and mineralized carbon. And this is actually really important in the carbon markets where people want to discount everything that biology creates. And it's like, well, that doesn't count. Like that can go away too. The thing can rot and that'll return some of the stuff back to the atmosphere. It's true. But mineralized carbon doesn't do that, right? But we've never been able to measure how much of the soil carbon was mineralized versus labile. And this basically does that in the same reading as it is doing the reading that tells you exactly which nutrients are missing from the soils and how to manage your land. So this, if anybody's an investor, this company is actively raising right now, but that's not the whole point here. This is just a point to say, think about the catalytic impacts of being able to give this kind of tool to all the farmers of the world. And not every farmer needs to own one either. You could go, measure stuff 3 times in a season and you would get a lot of the impact. So, a group of farmers could just share one, though we are quickly bringing down the cost of this. Our team has been working with this team. We already brought it down to 40,000 to less than 10,000. We're pretty sure we can get it to just a couple thousand when we get to manufacturing scale, which means it should be affordable. Farmers in the US spend $200,000 on a tractor. right? So getting it down to 1,000 or 2 should make it affordable for most folks. So with that, I've given you 2 important catalysts, but I'm going to do a little bit of a perpendicular, one. And this actually is an image that came the day before the first time I ever gave this talk. And you a bunch of worldly people, so you may recognize this, but we're on a rooftop in Quito, Ecuador. And it was 2018. And a really interesting thing happened. Like, I was out there to go speak to a group of Latin American entrepreneurs and like kind of, get more connected to that ecosystem and get them inspired to do this type of work. But it turned out that that point was exactly the same point as a different conference that was happening on exactly the same days, which was the 10-year anniversary of the rights of nature being added to the Ecuadorian constitution. Because Ecuador had some major economic issues. They got off of the peso, they moved on to the dollar. So if you go to Ecuador, they use the US dollar. And then they rewrote the constitution as the part of doing this. And when they rewrote the constitution, they added just a couple sentences, like 17 sentences, that have to do with the rights of nature. And paraphrasing a bit, it has to do with the right of a river to be able to flow, the right of a forest to be able to regenerate. And those are nice words to have on a piece of paper until it's actually tested in court. But like, what was great is 10 years on, a bunch of that actually got tested in court. And nature won a lot of the time. Now, unfortunately, when nature lost, it lost to oil companies because they also wrote oil into the Constitution. So it was a head-to-head constitutional battle. I don't know, I wasn't there, but you get it. But like in all the cases where they didn't constitutionally write that they could also damage the environment, then nature was winning. And that case law basically set that kind of tone that Ecuador can become a pioneer at a lot of these things and have been able to protect a lot of the ecosystem and have that function work that would have otherwise been destroyed. And I kind of mention this because all the catalysts I've been showing so far have to do with physical changes in the world, like a machine that can go plant 120 trees a minute, or like a machine that can be able to measure thousands of soil compounds in a minute. Great. But there are shifts in our consciousness that can make a difference as well. And I'll actually give you one more concrete one along these lines. So in other work that I did, so back in 2013, way before I started the firm, I was working with a team called Kingo Energy in northern Guatemala. And they basically help people that have never had electricity get access to electricity for the first time. And so far that organization has helped more than 1 million people get access to electricity for the first time in their lives. Long story short, though, these people live on $1 or $2 a day. So if you try to come to them and say, like, hey, we invented this thing, cost $150, you get all your energy through solar, it can power your cell phones, it can power your lights, all that kind of thing. People don't have great phones, but they actually, there's always some people in the village that have a phone. Anyway, then this could completely transform your life. Well, if you only live on $1 or $2 a day, how's that going to fit in your budget? So we actually decided to go change the sales and deployment model. Instead of the classic hardware retail model, where you basically sell a piece of hardware and you make all the money as the manufacturer at the point of sale, we made it into a pay-as-you-go model. And this sounds like a very small difference in consciousness, but here's the main difference. If I make all of my margin at the point of sale, I am highly incentivized to make the thing as cheap as possible. Well, it still works, so that I get the most money at the point of sale, right? So if the thing costs $30 to produce and I sell it for $100, if I can figure out a way to make it for $20, even better. And this is why we've had an entire generation of hardware that breaks down in so little time. I mean, if you have a blender from the 50s, it's fine. It's working great. If you have a cell phone that's 4 years old, it's like a piece of garbage. Right? Now, at the end of the day, that's because there was a piece of metal. It's like, what would be cheaper? Some injection molded plastic. So we'll change that out. Oh, what would be cheaper than this component that has got a mean time to failure of 20 years? Well, 10 years, because people change their cell phones every 5 years. So we'll just change this to 10 years. Right? And little by little, they get more margin, but it means that our devices basically, we don't have any devices that last 10 years anymore. It's crazy. So this tiny shift in consciousness here, and the way that people do this is called BOM optimization, where you stack rank it by the expense, all the components by expense, and then for all the expensive components, you figure out how to swap them out for cheaper components. This is how every hardware engineer on the planet does their work today. Now, the tiny consciousness shift when you go to pay-as-you-go is the following. I did the simple calculation that if we could modify the hardware, even if we added $5 to the cost of the hardware, if it could extend the life of the hardware by more than 6 months, that would more than pay for itself in a pay-as-you-go style. And given that, then, oh yes, I need to finish, sorry. Given that, then we were incentivized, instead of stack ranking by price and making everything cheap, we stack ranked by most likely to fail. And we actually made everything more robust. And we added about $14 to the cost of the device, but we've had this stuff in the jungles of Guatemala for over a decade now, and we've had almost 0 device failures. You could not be in a worse condition for electronics, but because we focus on mean time to failure as the optimization as opposed to lowest possible price, which is a tiny mind shift. Honestly, it took the same engineers. We didn't need to hire different staff. We did the whole thing in a month and a half. Right? So not different skills, just a slightly different mindset with a completely different outcome in terms of the reliability of it. So last thing I got to say, because I got to get off the stage, is I started a venture firm that only does this type of work. So you got a 35 invention catalysts right there. Or there's actually, some of them got cut off, sorry about that. But we have 35 investments right now. We had 150 million fund one. I'm almost done raising a 300 million fund two. So if you know folks that want to take part in fund two, then come talk to me. And with that, I gotta say thank you. Oh, and yes, if you want to talk to me, then I'm going to be at the climate, investing thing later tonight, and then also the one tomorrow. And also, I'll be around after this talk today. Okay, thank you.
All right, one more round of applause for Tom. That was amazing. And it's so inspiring to consider the kind of mindset shifts that can really take us into the next chapter, into this net positive future. And at Summit Impact, we really believe in understanding the question that Ayanna Johnson teaches us, which is, what happens if we get this right? What does it look like to create this better future? We also believe in really expanding our perspective to get a field level view of what's working, what's not, where resources are flowing, and to really be able to visualize the field to enhance the strategic decisions we make and the resource allocation that we use. And so we are very fortunate to collaborate with someone who is truly pioneering the work of visualizing and understanding the field of climate. Eric Berlow is a data ecologist. He's an expert in ecology, in complexity science, and in big data. He's currently the CEO at Vibrant Data Labs, where he builds open source tools to empower a growing ecosystem of partners that are tackling the climate crisis. And Eric's research on ecological complexity, which includes publications in Nature and Science, has been recognized among the top 1% of most highly cited papers in the field. So for anyone who's been in academia at all, you recognize just how significant that is. Eric is the founding director he was also the founding director of the University of California's first Science Institute at Yosemite National Park. He also co-founded a data interface company that was acquired by Rakuten. He is a TED Senior Fellow and was listed among top 100 creatives by Origin magazine. So hopefully now you're getting the picture that Eric's expertise spans across fields. And this makes him a particularly interesting person to hear from when it comes to trying to navigate the highly complex challenges like climate change. So we've had the fortune of partnering with Eric as he builds maps of the climate field and using them to inform our programs at Summit Impact. And I'm excited to hand the stage over to Eric now so he can share a bit of his approach and his perspective, and also an idea of how we can all be working on the most critical aspects of the climate field. So with that, please join me in giving a really warm welcome and round of applause to Eric Berlow.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Can you guys hear me? All right. Did that work? Okay, so the real problem we have here is that the climate crisis is an all-hands-on-deck problem, and yet none of the hands seems to know what the others are doing. So to solve that and to address that problem, we are building the first open source framework for helping everybody follow the money to climate solutions on the ground. We have, for the first version of this, we're tracking over $230 billion worth of private investments and grants to over 6,000 US-based climate-relevant companies and nonprofits. And to turn this big pile of who got funded into a map of who's doing what. What we do is we go for every organization, we find descriptions of their work online, and then we use the language of how they describe their own work to let this whole bubble self-organize into themes by letting similar organizations huddle together, and then they form their own climate themes. And so, for example, like renewable energy or electric vehicles or natural disasters. So this is really pretty, I love it, but what good is it? What are people using it for? I'd like to just share with you a little bit about, well, actually, just go back for a second, back. Yeah, so this summary of where the money's flowing, it's really important to note that it comes from the data bottom up. It's not what the funders say they're doing. It's coming from the language of how the grantees and investees on the ground are describing their work, and it has a lot of advantages, which I'll talk about later. So I just want to share with you how people are using this and what are some of the insights that we're learning early on about how impact-first money could be most impactful. So first of all, the primary use case for this tool, this tool explicitly is just for discovery. There's a lot of data filters, it's fully interactive, and it allows you to just very easily explore who's funding whom, who's tackling what problem where, who should I talk to for leads or diligence or potential funding. And I want to stress that this basic functionality of, let's say, just a basic visual CRM, or if you're older like me, it's a visual Rolodex of who's funding whom, is non-trivial. I use it almost every day just to look something up and quickly check something. And we hear people using that a lot. And part of it is because it has some very unique features. So one is that it's not just about climate mitigation, it also includes climate adaptation and resilience, the full spectrum. And it spans the three main solution areas defined by One Earth of the energy transition, food and agriculture, as well as nature. And so I think just more broadly, it helps people understand that climate relevant really expands beyond solar panels and batteries and electric cars, that there's, what's the breadth of the problem. The second unique feature is that by integrating here both investments and grants in one place, and the framework is flexible to add other layers, which we're very much hoping to do soon, each can provide context for the other. So really quickly, you can already see a non-random concentration of venture on the right side that's mostly focused in tech and mostly focused on mitigation. And in particular, there's been a lot of momentum in renewable energy and mobility. These clusters here are capturing more than 75% of the total money in this map. And then on the flip side, we can see in red all the grant-funded areas that mostly climate, nature-based solutions, climate resilience, the food system are mostly philanthropically funded. And this already suggests that in this view that there are a lot of problems that are just not currently inherently profitable to solve. And so that's a big role for philanthropic money. But you can also, once you have this here, you can also see what are those rare green dots in the sea of red, these rare green investments in grant-dominated themes, in nature-based solutions, et cetera. Just like Tom was just talking about, they are rare, those kinds of things, and they're really important. And so you start to see their rarity only because we also have philanthropy in here to show that they're unusual. And in particular, you can see, like in the food system, there's a growing momentum of green dots in here of investments, many in regenerative agriculture. What's interesting to me about these is that if you made this map 20 years ago, the electric vehicle cluster would have been a big red cluster of grants with a few scattered green investments. And so this is kind of a glimpse in the future of what are nascent markets and where can they go. And impact money can be really important in stimulating these new markets. So discovery, just informal discovery, can be very insightful, in addition to just a visual Rolodex. But what's been most interesting about that discovery is when people discover questions that we didn't think to ask. And so exploring new questions and diving into the data based on them has been really interesting. And I want to share with you a few of those insights that have come that are relevant to impact. So just for context, let's just step back. If we flatten this map into a bar chart, even though 55% of the points on the map were philanthropically funded, it only comprises 7% of the total funding as philanthropy. So philanthropy really is a drop in the bucket here. And then if we add in private equity, this is from a recent report by the Hewlett Foundation, venture is a drop in the bucket too. It's swamped by an order of magnitude by private equity. So if either philanthropy or venture wants to be really impactful, the key thing is that it has to be, every dollar has to be strategically allocated in order to really make a difference. So, so the question that we've been trying to address is, what are the underfunded critical gaps? And the reason why we focus on gaps for impact, there's a lot of reasons, and I want to just take a little detour to explain that. So as Shira mentioned, my background is in ecology. I've worked in everywhere from marine tide pools to alpine meadows to endangered amphibians. My work also is focused on understanding nature as a complex system. So I want to think about just one simple ecological problem. Let's say we're just trying to grow a tree. We know that trees need water and sunlight and nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. They're essential foundations. And if we want to go from a tree to a forest, we also need dispersal to colonize new sites, right, to scale from a tree to a forest. So, so the issue here is that these are, in ecological terms, they're limiting factors, because every one has to be solved for the tree to grow and for the forest to grow, because if anyone isn't there, the rest fail. And that's a particular kind of problem, and climate is like that. And so if you want to know what is the most impactful thing to fund, it's always going to be whatever thing is missing, whatever is the gap. So the gaps are the high impact areas. So if there's no water, it doesn't matter how much funding went to sunlight, nitrogen, or phosphorus, it won't grow unless you fill the water gap. And if there's no seed dispersal, then it'll never go to a forest, it'll never scale to a forest, even if that individual tree is really healthy and growing well. So we could take any sector like renewable energy mobility and try to break it down into core limiting factors. Like, we know that in the energy transition, we need successful power generation, we need storage, we need distribution, we need vehicles of all sorts, we need charging. And all of these are necessary. And if we want to scale it to everywhere, like a full energy transition, we need social equity. In other words, it's impossible to have 100% transition to renewable energy and mobility without 100% access. So these are all limiting factors, because if any one of these doesn't work, we lose. So how do we see that in the data? So what we did was we just summarized all the funding going to any companies or organizations that mention in their self-descriptions any terms related to generation of power, storage, distribution, vehicles of any type, charging. And already we see a glaring gap in connectivity or distribution of power and charging. And it's shocking to me that you can't just see these kinds of things really easily everywhere with every sector, because it's so obvious, but you don't see it until it's there, or you can't quantify it. So, so then what about the scaling gap for social equity? So because we have the language of how everybody just describes their work, we could also go back to everybody and calculate the fraction of money in each category that's going to companies that explicitly, in their own language, mention social equity or justice terms like energy access, energy poverty, underserved communities, affordability, et cetera. This is really coarse, and so there's a pervasive gap across the sector in explicitly addressing social equity, and this is a very conservative estimate, because we know people are mentioning the terms without necessarily successfully achieving them. So if we go back to our map, even though this is a very well-funded field, the best funded field, there are a couple really amazing opportunities for impact, which include addressing these limiting factors, these ecosystem gaps in distribution and charging, and the social equity gap for scaling to everybody. These are highly leveraged impact opportunities, because if successful, they unlock all the money that's already going to generation, storage, and vehicles. So they're really leveraged impact here. A third and final kind of gap that we explored, which came from a question from Elemental Accelerator, which is a climate funding arm of Emerson Collective. They focus on what they call the second valley of death, which is when climate tech companies die on the vine, like after early venture, when they're trying to move from innovation of the technology to deployment. They call this a deployment gap because it's a deployment gap that's caused by a weak link in the money food chain, so to speak. And part of it is because they can't they're not big enough to get like a $50 million project finance to get out in the world, but they need small project finance to just demonstrate the technology and vet it in real communities on the ground. And so they asked us this question, which is, does well-timed catalytic capital, which here is defined as non-equity funding in the form of grants or loans, does it help startups survive to later stages and raise more money? So we went back through the data, looked through the entire funding history, the funding sequence history of over 1,400 companies, and we found was really interesting that companies that had a prior grant, an early grant, were twice as likely to make it to late venture, and late and post-venture companies that had an early loan raised 3.5 to 5 times as much money as you'd expect by chance. And so this is, to my knowledge, the first empirical validation of this hypothesis that catalytic capital could be really catalytic. Okay, so that's just a quick summary of the climate finance tracker. The primary intended use of it, as I mentioned, is really for discovery, just to know who's funding what, where. And one of the most exciting forms of discovery is when we discover new questions that we didn't think to ask. And those have led us to identify at least 3 right now types of high impact opportunities. One is these are opportunities for impact first finance. One is to address and to find and fill ecosystem gaps, like these limiting factors that if they're not addressed, everything else fails. And these are highly leveraged impact opportunities because they unlock the success of all the other dependent areas where all the money's going. The second is filling the social equity gap, which is critical for scaling any solution to everybody. And this is, and also for empowering everybody to participate in this solution. And here, again, social equity is not just a nice thing to do, it's actually the answer. And finally, there's this opportunity to fill these deployment gaps, which come from weak links in the money food chain. This one is really important because, as Dawn Lippert from Elemental has said, this is the decade of deployment, not innovation. We only have, this is our one chance. So this is a really interesting opportunity. So anyway, I invite you to explore the data yourself. It's publicly hosted with our media partner, Impact Alpha, at impactalpha.com/CFT. It's not optimized for mobile, so wait till you have your laptop with you. And please hit me up with any questions if you discover questions that we didn't think to ask that would merit further investigation. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Eric. Let's give him one more big round of applause. Thank you. All right. I have 1 minute of closing announcements for y'all just to tell you what's coming up next. So right now, we're just kicking off this event. We're just getting started. And we'd love for you to join us at climate meetups and climate sessions happening over the next few days. I also want to highlight that Eric and also Pep, one of our other speakers, will be doing an interactive session tomorrow morning. That'll be a lot more of discussion with folks in this room and exploring what it actually means to move capital and move resources in the most effective ways in this field. We're also doing an interactive session at 5:30 on Saturday with some incredible entrepreneurs working on coral reef restoration and on conservation in the Amazon and what it looks like to create a market for conservation as opposed to extraction, some of the different topics that Tom touched on earlier, and that's 5:30 Saturday. So look out for climate meetups, look out for climate sessions, and the other thing to look out for are these poster boards that Ashley is holding up over there with the QR code that you can scan that has all of the impact programming happening on the ship. You'll see a link tree. It also has a link to join the Climate Collaboratory. That's a group of summiters who are going to engage in climate over the next few months. You'll receive updates on everything we're doing. You'll receive the first invitations to the events that we're planning in places like Paris and at Climate Week in New York. And you'll also have opportunities to share your input and ideas and really shape our programs. So that's all. I want to let you all get outside to the sunshine / possible stormy weather. We'll see. Something's rolling in. But just really enjoy your time at Summit at Sea. Thank you for the kind attention and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.